The wind, a jagged blade of ice, scoured the skeletal trees, shrieking its mournful lament across the desolate plains. It clawed at Lyra's threadbare shawl, biting through cloth and flesh alike, threatening to strip the very marrow from her bones. She lay curled, fetal-like, beside the crude, shallow grave she dug with numb fingers and a broken shovel, not for warmth, but for proximity. The earth beneath her was a frozen slab, offering no solace, no comfort, only the unyielding reality of what it now held. Her mother, gone. Not to illness, not to old age, but to the swift, brutal swing of a raider's axe. Their greed a ravenous beast that had devoured everything. Lyra, hidden in the root cellar, had heard the screams, the frantic thud of boots, the final gurgling gasp, before the silence, thick and suffocating, had descended. It had been days. Days since the wagon, their sole means of escape, had been splintered for firewood by the very men who'd taken everything else. Days since the last ember of hope had flickered and died. Now her tears were frozen tracks on her gaunt cheeks, her throat raw from the guttural sobs she'd stifled, then abandoned in her despair. Her hunger was a dull ache, constant and insistent, a cruel counterpoint to the sharper, keener pain of loss. Every breath was a struggle, every heartbeat a testament to a will she didn't know she possessed, or perhaps, a curse. Why had she survived? Why had fate deemed her worthy of this prolonged agony while her mother lay cold beneath the unforgiving soil? The question clawed at her, an icy tendril of madness in the gathering twilight. Her eyes, sunken and shadowed, scanned the horizon, hoping for nothing, expecting only the encroaching night and its inevitable end. A figure, dark against the pale, bruised sky, appeared at the crest of the hill. A rider, her heart, a trapped bird, began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Fear, sharp and primal, pierced through the numbness. She tried to scramble back, to disappear into the meager shadows of the scrub, but her limbs were leaden, unresponsive. The man dismounted, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if the bitter wind and the desolate landscape were mere inconveniences. He was tall, broad-shouldered, cloaked in heavy, patched furs that made him seem a part of the wilderness itself. A rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm, a silent promise of lethality. He didn't call out, didn't shout. He simply walked, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, straight towards her. Lyra shrank back, her breath catching in her throat, a desperate prayer forming on her lips, unspoken. His face, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, was rugged, weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of a hard, solitary life. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of slate, devoid of warmth, yet curiously not of malice. They held a raw, unsettling stillness that spoke volumes. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over the crude mound of earth, then back to her, lingering on the terror in her eyes, the raw grief that distorted her features. He saw the shovel, the small, desperate signs of struggle. He saw the cold, the hunger, the utter desolation etched into her very being. "Girl." His voice was a low rasp, rough as flint. "You alone." Lyra flinched, unable to speak, only manage a small, choked sound. She shook her head, tears welling anew, blurring his imposing silhouette. She gripped her arms tightly, as if to hold herself together against the immense, crushing weight of the world. He knelt, slowly, cautiously, not threateningly, but with a weary grace. His rifle remained in his hand, a constant presence. "No one else," he clarified, his voice still low, almost gentle, incongruous with his hard-edged appearance. Her gaze flickered to the grave, then back to him, a silent plea, a desperate confirmation. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He understood. The raiders, the loneliness, the impossible cold. He saw not just a girl, but a broken spirit, a lingering echo of the wilderness's cruelty. He reached out, not to her, but to a battered tin canteen at his belt. "Water," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless. And some hardtack. You'll freeze before dawn. His words, stark and practical, were a lifeline thrown into an abyss of despair. The choice was stark. Remain and succumb, or trust this formidable stranger, whose very presence was as unsettling as the landscape itself. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the incessant wail of the wind. Lyra stared at the extended canteen, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a desperate, primal urge to survive. The offer was not a kindness, she sensed, but a cold assessment of need, a calculation. He would not wait forever. The last rays of the sun bled from the sky, painting the west in shades of violent violet and bruised purple. The cold deepened, seeping into her bones, stealing what little warmth remained. Her mother's face, peaceful in death, flashed before her eyes. "Live Lyra," she'd always said. "No matter what, live." The words, faint and distant, echoed in the wind. Lyra's fingers trembled as she reached out, slowly, tentatively, to take the canteen. Her gaze remained fixed on his, searching for deceit, for a trap, finding only that same unsettling stillness. He watched her drink, her throat working convulsively, the water a blessed coolness on her parched tongue. He offered a piece of dried meat, tough and stringy, but nourishing. Lyra ate mechanically, her eyes darting between him and the horizon, the stark reality of her situation pressing in. He observed her without comment, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling chaos of her grief. He wasn't a savior, she knew, not in any conventional sense. He was a survivor, carved from the same unforgiving land that had claimed her family. Their paths had intersected not by chance, but by the brutal logic of desperation. The night deepened, bringing with it a more profound chill. Elias, for that was the name he finally uttered, a single, clipped syllable, stood up. "We move," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No fire. Not here," he gestured vaguely to the north. "My camp is closer to the river." Some shelter. Lyra hesitated, her heart still a drum in her chest, but the instinct to live, to simply be, was a powerful, driving force. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbly, her body aching, and followed him into the deepening twilight. The world had shrunk to the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the frozen earth, the biting wind, and the silent, imposing figure of the man who had, for reasons unknown, offered her a sliver of continued existence. The memory of her mother's peaceful, lifeless face was a cold comfort, urging her forward, away from the desolate grave. The journey through the deepening gloom was a torturous blur of icy wind and numbing cold. Lyra stumbled often, her exhaustion profound, her muscles screaming with protest. Elias never offered a hand, nor did he look back, but his pace remained steady, just slow enough for her to keep up. He was a shadow ahead of her, a silent, unyielding presence that pulled her forward through sheer force of will. She focused on the rhythm of his steps, the broad expanse of his back, anything to distract from the gnawing fear and the relentless chill. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped. Before them, tucked into a shallow overhang of rock, was a meager camp. A small fire, painstakingly built, flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cave wall. The warmth, though minimal, felt like a miracle. Lyra sank to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so violently she feared they would shatter. Elias crouched by the fire, adding a few dry twigs, coaxing the flames higher. He didn't speak, didn't fuss. He simply passed her a worn, patched blanket. "Wrap yourself," he grunted, his voice still rough, but with a subtle inflection that Lyra, in her heightened state of awareness, recognized as a rudimentary form of care. She pulled the wool around her, inhaling the scent of smoke and dust, a surprisingly comforting aroma. For the first time in days, the ice in her veins began to thaw. Her mind, however, remained a chaotic jumble of images. Her mother's last breath, the raiders' cruel laughter, the endless, empty plains. She kept her distance, huddled by the fire, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames, occasionally darting towards Elias, who sat across from her, sharpening a small knife with methodical precision. He seemed oblivious to her scrutiny, his concentration absolute. He was an enigma, a man carved from the silence of the wilderness. Hours passed in this quiet vigil. The wind howled outside their small shelter, but within, the fire's crackle was the only sound. Lyra's hunger returned, a dull, persistent ache. Elias eventually offered her another piece of dried meat and a cup of something warm brewed from foraged roots. The bitter liquid warmed her from the inside out, settling her stomach. "Who are you?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible above the wind. He paused, his hands stilling their task. He looked up, his slate eyes meeting hers. "Elias," he repeated, as if that was all she needed to know. He didn't ask for her name, didn't pry into her past. He offered no sympathy, no platitudes, only facts, stark and unadorned. His silence, Lyra realized, was not coldness, but a refusal to trespass on her grief. He was not a man of words, but of actions. He had found her, offered succor, and taken her to what meager safety he possessed. Over the next few days they moved. Elias was a tracker, a hunter, a man deeply attuned to the rhythms of the land. He moved with an economical grace, reading the subtle signs of the wild, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of snow, the flight of birds. Lyra followed, learning to conserve her energy, to watch, to listen. She observed how he cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, how he laid snares, how he moved through the hushed forests with the stealth of a ghost. He taught her, not with words but by example, how to build a fire from wet wood, how to identify edible roots, how to patch a tear in her clothing. He spoke little, but his actions were a constant lesson in survival. She began to shed some of her fear, replacing it with a quiet determination. The profound, suffocating despair still lingered, a heavy cloak around her heart, but beneath it, a tiny flicker of resilience began to glow. She saw the raw competence in him, the quiet strength that radiated from his stoic form. There was no pretense, no artifice. He was simply a man surviving, and by his grim, unspoken decree, she would survive too. One evening, as Lyra stared into the dying embers of their fire, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. The raiders, their faces obscured by grime, their eyes alight with a predatory glee. The screams, her mother's desperate fight. A shudder ran through her. Elias, who had been watching the horizon, shifted his gaze to her. He said nothing, but his eyes, unusually perceptive, seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed composure, seeing the raw, unhealed wound. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to speak, to confide the full horror of what she had witnessed, but the words caught in her throat. He simply nodded, a slow, understanding gesture, as if acknowledging a shared burden, a commonality in the harshness of their world. This silent understanding, more potent than any words, began to forge an unspoken bond between them, fragile yet resilient, like a new shoot pushing through frozen ground. Their journey continued, a relentless march through the unforgiving landscape. Days blurred into a rhythm of walking, foraging, and sparse, necessary rest. Lyra's body, once brittle and weak, began to harden. Her steps grew surer, her gaze more direct. The constant fight for survival had, paradoxically, begun to dull the sharp edges of her grief, replacing it with a quiet, steely resolve. She still carried the weight of her mother's death, but it no longer threatened to crush her. Instead, it had become a part of her, a grim reminder of the stakes, a spur to keep moving forward. Elias, ever vigilant, remained her silent guide. He had taught her to read the signs of the land, and now he taught her to read the signs of men. One afternoon, as they trekked through a densely forested valley, Elias suddenly froze. His hand, quick as a viper, went to the hilt of the large knife at his belt. His body tensed, every muscle coiled. Lyra, her senses now honed by weeks of hardship, immediately sensed the shift in the air, the subtle change in the forest's quiet hum. She scanned the trees, her heart beginning to pound. A branch snapped, not from the wind, but from a clumsy footfall. Elias pushed her behind a thick fir tree. His eyes narrowed, scanning the shadowed woods. "Stay low," he muttered, his voice a guttural whisper, laced with an urgency she had not heard before. No sound. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, ragged and unkempt, their faces hardened by desperation and something darker. They carried crude weapons, a rusted axe, a long, gnarled club, a short hunting knife. Their clothes were patched and filthy, their eyes hollow like famished wolves. Lyra's breath hitched. They were scavengers, likely the same kind of men who had taken everything from her. Her old fear, dormant for weeks, surged back, cold and paralyzing. She recognized the look in their eyes, a dangerous hunger. They were not just hungry for food, but for anything they could take, for any vulnerability they could exploit. Elias stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between Lyra and the approaching men. He stood tall, his stance wide, his rifle held loosely but purposefully. He was a sentinel, formidable and unyielding. "Lost, gentlemen?" Elias's voice was deceptively calm, a low rumble that seemed to fill the quiet forest. The lead man, a burly figure with a matted beard and a cruel smile, spat on the ground. "Lost? We're finding, stranger. And looks like we found ourselves a pair of fresh pickings." His eyes, glinting with malice, darted towards Lyra, still partially hidden behind the tree. "And a pretty little thing, too?" Lyra felt a surge of cold fury, eclipsing her fear. She remembered the glint of the axe, the horror of that day. These men were a mirror of her past, a resurgence of the cruelty she thought she had outrun. Elias's gaze hardened. "She's with me," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless, yet radiating a silent warning. The air crackled with tension. The scavengers exchanged glances, their earlier confidence faltering slightly in the face of Elias's unwavering presence. He didn't threaten, didn't boast, but the sheer force of his quiet resolve was a palpable threat. They had clearly underestimated him. The lead man, though, was too far gone in his desperation to back down. He gestured to his companions. "Easy pickings," he says. 3 against 1, old man. Drop the rifle. Elias didn't move a muscle. His eyes, fixed on the leader, were like chips of stone. Lyra, watching from her hiding place, saw something stir in his gaze, a quiet readiness for battle that spoke of long, hard-won experience. The moment stretched, taut and agonizing. Suddenly Elias moved, not towards them, but a subtle shift of his body, barely perceptible, that put him in a more advantageous position. His rifle now raised, pointed not at any man, but just above their heads. The click of the safety being disengaged was loud in the sudden stillness of the forest. The scavengers flinched, their eyes widening. Elias did not speak, but the message was clear. He would not yield. He was prepared to fight, and he was prepared to win. The lead scavenger, his bravado finally cracking, hesitated. He looked at Elias's unyielding face, then at the rifle, then at the 2 men behind him, whose own resolve was visibly wavering. They had anticipated an easy score, not a fight to the death against a man who clearly had nothing left to lose. The silence was broken only by the wind whispering through the pines. After what felt like an eternity, the lead man lowered his club, a sneer twisting his lips. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, turning to his companions. Plenty of other lambs out there. With a final venomous glare at Elias, they melted back into the trees, their footsteps fading into the distance. Lyra watched them go, her heart still hammering, but a new sensation stirring within her. A strange mix of relief and fierce pride. Elias had not merely protected her. He had done so with a quiet, formidable power that left no doubt of his capabilities. Elias lowered his rifle, the tension slowly draining from his formidable frame. He turned to Lyra, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "They're gone," he stated, his voice still rough but carrying a note of reassurance. Lyra stepped out from behind the fir tree, her legs a little shaky, but her eyes bright with a mixture of awe and dawning understanding. The fear that had gripped her had dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude and something more, a newfound admiration for this stoic, solitary man. He hadn't said a word about his intentions, hadn't made a promise, yet he had stood against a threat that mirrored her deepest trauma, and he had prevailed. The encounter, though brief, was a turning point. It had stripped away the last vestiges of Lyra's helplessness. She had seen true danger, confronted it, and watched as Elias, with his quiet strength, had averted disaster. This was not a world for the weak, nor for those who waited to be saved. This was a world that demanded resilience, ingenuity, and, crucially, partnership. That evening, as they huddled by a small, carefully concealed fire, Lyra spoke. Not about the raiders, not about her fear, but about the future. "We need a place," she said, her voice stronger than she remembered it being. "Somewhere away from them. Somewhere safe." Elias listened, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he merely grunted, a sound that could mean anything, but Lyra detected a hint of agreement. Over the following weeks, their bond deepened, quietly, organically. Lyra began to actively contribute, her skills improving with each passing day. She learned to set snares, to track small game, to identify the subtle signs of human presence. She was no longer just a burden, a fragile survivor. She was a partner, tenacious and resourceful. Elias, in turn, began to show her more of his world, guiding her through hidden pathways, teaching her the lore of the land, sharing his vast, unspoken knowledge. He would still say little, but his infrequent words carried immense weight, and his actions spoke volumes. He began to trust her instincts, to rely on her keen eyesight and quick wit. They were two solitary souls, forged in the crucible of hardship, now bound by shared experience and a common purpose. They traveled north, towards the mountains, Elias's unspoken goal. The air grew colder, the terrain more rugged, but the threat of other desperate men seemed to lessen. One frigid afternoon, they came across a small, dilapidated cabin, tucked into a sheltered valley, half hidden by a copse of pines. It was a ruin, battered by years of neglect, but its stone chimney still stood, and its walls, though warped, offered a semblance of shelter. Elias stopped, looking at the cabin, then at Lyra. His gaze was uncharacteristically hesitant. "Could be made right," he rumbled, his voice a little softer than usual. "With work." Lyra stared at the cabin. It wasn't a grand home, not a promise of luxury, but it was a beginning, place. Her own hands, she knew, could make it a home. She looked at Elias, the man who had pulled her from the brink, who had guided her, quietly and without complaint, through the desolate wilderness. He was not just a protector. He was a steadfast presence, a silent promise of strength in a world that offered so little. The sorrow of her past, the profound loss of her mother, would always be a part of her, a deep, unhealing scar. But it no longer defined her. It had been the crucible that had forged her spirit, and it had led her to this unexpected, quiet partnership. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Lyra's lips, a rare expression that transformed her gaunt features. "We'll make it right," she affirmed, her voice clear and strong, full of a quiet determination. Elias met her gaze, and for the first time, Lyra saw something akin to quiet contentment flicker in his slate eyes. They had started in the shadow of death, bound by a tragedy that seemed insurmountable. Yet, from that profound sadness, from the ashes of loss, something new had emerged, not a storybook ending, but a testament to human resilience, to the quiet power of shared purpose, and the strength found in unexpected connection. They were survivors, yes, but more than that, they were builders, ready to carve a new life from the unforgiving earth, side by side. The journey had been born of profound sorrow, but it had led them, against all odds, to a quiet dignity, a hard-won peace, and the unspoken promise of a shared future.